The church of St. Michael's sat in a fold of green country between the village of Hartwell and the high road to London, and on the morning of the 14th of June in the year 1813, its doors stood open to receive a bride no one in the parish believed had earned the occasion. Eleanor Graves stood in the vestry with her hands folded and her borrowed gown pinned at the waist where it did not quite fit, and she watched through the narrow window as the carriages arrived one by one along the lane, bringing guests who had come less to celebrate than to confirm what they already knew. That she was fortunate, that Mr. Bertram Graves was generous beyond reason, that a woman whose father had died leaving nothing save a library of annotated sermons and a name attached to no income, no land, and no connection of consequence ought to be grateful for any offer at all, and certainly for this one. Mrs. Penwick had said as much that morning while lacing the gown. She had said it with her hands at Eleanor's stays, and her voice bright with the particular warmth that belonged to people who enjoyed being kind to those they considered beneath them. "You must smile when he sees you," she had instructed, tugging the lace collar flat. "A bride who does not smile suggests she has been made to come, and we cannot have that." Eleanor had not answered. She had pressed her thumb against the small brass compass hidden inside her left glove, the one object she had kept when the rest of Captain Nathaniel Ashworth's personal effects had been returned to his mother 11 months earlier in a canvas bag that smelled of salt and foreign earth. The compass had not been his, strictly. It had belonged to his elder brother George, and Nathaniel had carried it through 2 campaigns and written her once that it was the only piece of England he could hold in his hand while the guns sounded. She had taken it from the bag before anyone else could claim it, and she had kept it against her skin every day since, and she did not intend to remove it today, simply because today was the day she was to marry a man she did not love, in order to remain in the only house she had ever known. The churchyard was filling. She could see Mrs. Haddow, the old housekeeper from Kelmore Park, standing apart from the others near the lych gate, with her hands clasped, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who disapproved of something she could not prevent. She could see Arabella Forster in pale blue, laughing with the curate's wife, her gloved hand resting on the arm of a gentleman Eleanor did not recognize. She could see Bertram himself at the church door, with his chin lifted and his coat brushed, and his posture suggesting that the morning was proceeding exactly as he had arranged it, which it was. What she could not see, because the vestry window faced east and the road from London entered the village from the north, was the rider who had passed through Hartwell at dawn on a bay horse still flecked with the dust of 3 counties, and who had stopped at the inn long enough to ask a single question of the innkeeper's boy, and who had received a single answer, and who had not dismounted again since. She did not see it yet. "You will." The bells began. Mrs. Penwick appeared at the vestry door, her smile precise and practiced. "Come, my dear," she said. "Mr. Graves is waiting." Eleanor pressed the compass one final time through the thin kid of her glove. She felt the ridge of its engraved case, the small raised letter she had traced so many times in the dark that she could have drawn it from memory with her eyes closed. She released her breath. She stepped forward into the nave. The Reverend Mr. Graves had died 14 months earlier, in March, at the age of 53, of a fever that had begun as a cough and ended as silence. He had left Eleanor a name, a modest education, an ability to read French and Italian that had no market value in Hartwell, and absolutely nothing else. The living at St. Michael's had not been his to pass on. It belonged to the gift of Sir Philip Alderton, whose family had held patronage over the parish since the reign of George II, and Sir Philip had bestowed it promptly upon the Reverend's nearest male relation, a second cousin named Bertram Graves, who had been curate at a parish in Gloucestershire, and who arrived at the vicarage 6 weeks after the funeral with 2 trunks, a widowed sister and the settled conviction that Eleanor owed him something for the inconvenience of still being present. Eleanor had understood her position from the first evening, when Mrs. Penwick had inventoried the linen cupboard aloud and observed in her bright particular voice that the Reverend had lived very simply indeed. Had he not? Almost as if he had forgotten he might someday leave a daughter behind. Eleanor had said nothing. She had been clearing her father's desk at the time, wrapping his reading spectacles in a square of cloth, and her hands had been steady enough that neither Mrs. Penwick nor Bertram could have seen what the steadiness cost. She had nowhere to go. Her mother had died when she was 11. Her father's family was small and scattered, and none of them prosperous. She had no training as a governess, no connection to place her in service, and no fortune of any kind. £200 per annum was the value of the living, and Bertram controlled every penny. He was not unkind in the way of men who enjoy cruelty. He was worse. He was kind in the way of men who believe their kindness creates a debt, and who keep a running tally that they present when convenient. The tally had been presented in April, 2 months before the wedding. Bertram had called Eleanor into the parlor after supper, and Mrs. Penwick had been seated in the corner, working at her embroidery with the concentrated attention of a woman who wished it known she was not listening. "You understand your position, Miss Graves," Bertram had said, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have sheltered you these 12 months without complaint. I have fed you and clothed you, and kept you from the parish workhouse. I think it is fair to say you owe your comfort, such as it is, entirely to my good will." Eleanor had stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level. She had known what was coming, because Mrs. Penwick had dropped 3 careful hints across as many days, each one slightly more explicit than the last, and Eleanor had not survived a year in their household by failing to read the weather. "I am offering you marriage," Bertram had continued. "You will be mistress of this house by right, rather than by sufferance. Your name will be Mrs. Graves again, as it was when your father lived, and no one in the parish need ever wonder what is to become of the vicar's charity case." The vicar's charity case. She had heard Mrs. Penwick use the phrase 2 days earlier, speaking to Bertram in this same parlor when they had believed Eleanor to be upstairs. She had been on the stairs, carrying mending, and the words had risen to meet her with perfect clarity. "The vicar's charity case, Louisa will be grateful." She always is. The alternative to marriage had been plain. Bertram had not needed to say it aloud, and he had not. Mrs. Penwick's embroidery needle had paused for exactly the length of time it took Eleanor to understand that refusal would mean departure before Michaelmas, with no reference and no income, and no protection beyond whatever a 23-year-old woman with no fortune could devise for herself in a country at war. She had said yes. She had said it quietly, with her hands folded, and she had gone upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and held the brass compass against the inside of her wrist where the pulse lived. And she had not wept because weeping would not change anything, and she had already learned that lesson once when the canvas bag had arrived from Portugal. She had been betrothed before, privately, without announcement, without formal arrangement, because Captain Nathaniel Ashworth had been the second son of Viscount Ashworth of Kelmore Park, and Eleanor had been the daughter of a country vicar whose entire fortune could not have furnished one room at Kelmore, and they had both understood that the world they moved through would not have sanctioned the match until Nathaniel returned from the war with his commission sold and his future his own to direct. He had promised. She had believed him. He had given her the compass the morning he left, pressing it into her palm beside the low wall at the edge of the churchyard where the yew trees blocked the road from view. And he had said, "Keep this until I come for it." And she had said, "You will come for it." And he had not answered. because they had both known that no answer was safe. He had not come for it. The dispatch from his regiment had arrived the previous July, 11 months before the wedding, delivered to his mother, the Viscountess at Kelmore Park. Captain Nathaniel Ashworth, second son of the late Viscount, had been killed in action at the siege of Badajoz. His personal effects had been returned. His name had been read at the county assizes. His mother, already bereaved of her elder son George the year before, had closed Kelmore Park and removed to Bath, and the house had stood silent on its hill ever since, its windows dark against the Hertfordshire sky. Eleanor had received no letter. She had received no visit. She had received the compass from the canvas bag because nobody else had known what it was or why a dead officer's effects should contain an old brass navigational instrument engraved with a letter that did not match his Christian name. In the months between the proposal and the wedding, Eleanor had lived inside the vicarage the way a person lives inside a borrowed coat, aware in every moment that it did not fit and could be reclaimed. She had continued to tend her father's garden, the herbs and the roses and the small patch of lavender that he had planted the year her mother died. She had continued to read to old Mrs. Cotter in the village, who was blind and who had no family, and who cried quietly every Tuesday afternoon when Eleanor closed the book and promised to return. She had mended the choir robes without being asked. She had cleaned the communion silver without being thanked. She had lived, in short, exactly as she had lived before the proposal, with the steady, attentive care of a woman who understood that the only dignity available to her was the dignity she enacted, and she had enacted it every day, and it had cost her more than anyone in the parish would ever know. Mrs. Penwick had noticed the mending and the silver and the garden, and she had drawn from them the conclusion that suited her. "She keeps busy to be useful," she had told the Alderton ladies at the subscription tea, her voice carrying the particular warmth that substituted for discretion. "One must admire it, I suppose." The vicar's charity case. Making herself indispensable. It is what they do, the ones with nothing. The Alderton ladies had nodded. Eleanor had been pouring the tea and had heard every word, and she had continued pouring without spilling a drop, and her face had not changed, and Mrs. Penwick had not glanced at her because Mrs. Penwick had long since stopped registering Eleanor as a person who could hear. On the morning of the wedding, while Mrs. Penwick laced the borrowed gown in the vestry, Arabella Forster had arrived at the church early with her mother and taken up a position near the door where she could greet arriving guests with the proprietary ease of a woman who considered the occasion partly her own. Eleanor had heard her through the vestry window, her voice bright and carrying in the June air. "Oh, you must not pity her, Mrs. Alderton. It is really a very good match for what she is. The vicar's charity case getting her plain little wedding at last, and Mr. Graves so patient with her besides. I call it a happy ending." A happy ending. Eleanor had stood very still with Mrs. Penwick's hands at her collar and the compass pressed inside her glove, and the specific knowledge that this was the story the parish had written for her, the story in which she was fortunate and grateful and small. And she had felt the old familiar tide of something that was not grief and not anger and not shame, but the place where all three met. The place she had lived inside since the canvas bag arrived from Portugal. She had closed her hand around the compass. She had felt its weight, its warmth, the engraved ridge against her skin. She had decided, in that moment, that she would walk into the nave with her father's name on her lips and Nathaniel's compass against her palm, and she would marry Bertram with her eyes open and her spine straight and her grief private, and she would not allow the vicar's charity case to be the last sentence of her story, even if she could not yet imagine what the next sentence might be. And now it was June, and the bells were ringing. and she was walking toward Bertram through a nave full of witnesses who had already decided what she was and what this morning meant. The church smelled of beeswax and cut roses. Mrs. Penwick had arranged the flowers the evening before, and their scent hung in the warm air with the sweetness of something given freely to a celebration that had been built on terms. The pews were filled mostly with Bertram's connections. Sir Philip Alderton sat in the front row with his wife, their presence a confirmation of the patron's approval. Arabella Forster sat 3 rows back with her mother, her posture correct and her expression composed, and her fan moving in slow, regular strokes that suggested she had practiced being seen, not minding. The curate, Mr. Dowling, stood at the chancel rail with the prayer book open. Eleanor reached the front of the nave and took her place beside Bertram. He did not look at her. He looked at the curate, and then at Sir Philip, and then at the door, as if confirming that the audience was complete and the production could begin. Mr. Dowling began to read. The familiar words filled the nave, and Eleanor heard them the way one hears rain on a window when the mind is far away, present and rhythmic and not quite real. She felt the compass against her palm. She felt the pins in the borrowed gown pressing at her waist. She felt the specific quality of standing very still while something irreversible approached, the way a letter approaches the hand that will have to open it. She had made her choice. She would marry Bertram, and she would do it with her eyes open, and she would not pretend that the compass in her glove was anything other than what it was, a dead man's keepsake, the only inheritance she had claimed for herself. 50 yards away, at the edge of the churchyard, a man dismounted from a bay horse and stood for a long moment looking at the church. He was tall and too thin, and his coat was not the coat of a gentleman, but the worn broadcloth of a soldier mustered out with nothing but his horse and his papers. There was a scar along his jaw, pale against the sun-browned skin, and his hands, when he tied the horse to the iron ring at the lych gate, moved with the care of a man for whom the simple acts of living had only recently become possible again. He reached inside his coat and touched something there, a folded letter, and his face changed for an instant before settling back into the expression he had carried for 600 miles. Mrs. Haddow saw him first. She was still standing at the gate when he approached, and she looked at him the way one looks at a face that cannot possibly be where it is, with the careful attention of someone checking a sum that refuses to balance. Her lips parted. Her hand went to her throat. She said nothing, because what she was seeing was impossible. And she was not a woman who spoke before she was certain. He walked past her toward the church. He did not run. He walked at the pace of a man crossing a ballroom, measured and controlled. And his boots sounded on the stone path with a regularity that the nearest guests would later remember as the only warning they were given. Inside the nave, Mr. Dowling had reached the portion of the service that the law required. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The silence that followed was the ordinary silence of a country wedding, the perfunctory pause that no one expected to be interrupted. Bertram shifted his weight. Mrs. Penwick adjusted her gloves. Eleanor looked at the stone floor and felt the compass and did not breathe. The door opened. It opened slowly, which was worse than if it had been thrown wide, because the slowness meant intention, and intention meant that whoever stood on the other side had not come to watch. The afternoon light fell in a bright column across the flagstones. The guests in the rear pews turned. A murmur ran forward through the church like wind through standing corn, each row turning to the next, each face rearranging. Eleanor did not turn. She heard the murmur, and she felt the air change when the door opened and she registered the quality of the silence that replaced the murmur. And she did not turn because she knew, in the place where the body knows things the mind has not yet permitted, that if she turned now, she would see something that would undo every carefully constructed wall she had built in 11 months of grieving a man she had never been allowed to grieve aloud. She turned. He stood in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered, and the scar was new, and his coat was wrong, and his posture was not the posture of the man who had pressed a compass into her hand beside the churchyard wall. It was the posture of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time, and had just set it down. His eyes found her across the length of the nave. They found her the way water finds a crack in stone, with the patient inevitability of something that has been traveling toward this exact point for longer than anyone watching could know. Mrs. Haddo appeared in the doorway behind him. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the way a voice carries in a church when no one else is breathing. "Lord Ashworth," she said. 2 words. They landed in the nave the way a stone lands in still water, with a sound out of all proportion to their weight. Mrs. Penwick's fan stopped moving. Bertram's face lost its composure in a single visible dissolution, the color leaving his cheeks in a way that the front pew could see and the back pew could guess. Sir Philip Alderton half rose from his seat. Arabella Forster's mouth opened and did not close. Nathaniel walked forward. He did not look at Bertram. He did not look at Mrs. Penwick. He did not look at Sir Philip or the curate or the pressed ranks of startled faces on either side. He looked at Eleanor, and his eyes carried the specific quality of a man who has crossed 3 countries and 600 miles and 11 months of reported death for the sole purpose of arriving in this nave at this moment and saying what he was about to say. He stopped 3 paces from her. The church was silent. The roses smelled very strong. "Miss Graves is my betrothed, and I am very much alive." The sentence landed in the silence the way the compass had landed in her palm beside the churchyard wall, heavy and warm and closing her fingers around something she had believed she would never hold again. 11 words. No declaration of love. No accusation against Bertram. No explanation of where he had been or why. A name claimed. A fact stated. The minimum sufficient to end what was happening and begin what should have been happening all along. Mr. Dowling closed the prayer book. It was the sound of the book closing that broke the spell, the soft, definitive clap of leather covers meeting, and the church erupted. Not into chaos, into the particular ordered commotion of English society adjusting its records, a sound composed of whispered surnames and half-turned shoulders, and the rapid, small movements of people repositioning themselves relative to new information. Sir Philip Alderton sank back into his seat and placed one hand on his wife's arm, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just realized that the patronage he extended last year may require recalibration. The curate's wife clutched at her husband's sleeve. 3 rows back, Mrs. Forster pulled her daughter closer, with the reflexive urgency of a woman removing a child from the path of something falling. Bertram found his voice. "This is preposterous," he said, and the word came out too high, pitched wrong for the room, and he seemed to know it because he repeated it in a lower register. "Preposterous. Captain Ashworth is dead. The dispatch confirmed it. His name was read at the county assizes." "The dispatch was in error," Nathaniel said. His voice was low and level, and offered nothing beyond the statement. "I was wounded at Badajoz and taken to a monastery outside Elvas, where I lay for 4 months without the ability to write or send word. When I recovered sufficiently to travel, I was returned to my regiment, and from there to England. I arrived at Kelmore Park 3 days ago, and learned that my brother George had died, that I am Viscount Ashworth, and that Miss Graves was to be married this morning to a man she does not love, in a church her father built his ministry inside, under conditions no woman of her quality should have been made to accept. He had not raised his voice. He had delivered the entire account in the same level tone he might have used to report a position on a battlefield, and it was the levelness that made the room believe him, because grief performed loudly invites doubt, and grief delivered quietly invites only silence. Mrs. Penwick stood. She stood the way a woman stands when the floor she has been standing on reveals itself to be ice over a river, with a sudden arrested rigidity that exposed how much of her confidence had depended on Nathaniel Ashworth being dead. "This cannot be," she said. "There are procedures. There are papers to be examined. You cannot simply walk into a church and claim a woman who has already given her consent." "I can," Nathaniel said, "if the woman was promised to me first, and if the consent she gave was given under the duress of having no alternative, and if I am alive to offer the alternative that was taken from her." He had still not looked at Bertram. The refusal to look was itself a statement, a precise calibration that denied Bertram the dignity of being treated as an opponent and offered him instead the lesser status of an obstacle that had been walked around. A small sound from the door. Mr. Selwick, the solicitor from the county town, stepped into the nave carrying a leather case under his arm. He was a gray-haired man with spectacles and the unhurried manner of someone whose profession had taught him that most crises resolve themselves once the correct document is produced. He approached Sir Philip Alderton, opened the case, and withdrew a sheaf of papers bearing a War Office seal and a second document bearing the seal of the College of Arms. "Confirmation of identity," he said, addressing Sir Philip with the comfortable deference of a professional to a patron. "Captain Nathaniel Ashworth, now Viscount Ashworth of Kelmore, confirmed living and restored to the rolls. I have the verification from his commanding officer and the confirmation of his succession to the viscountcy following the death of his brother George, the 4th Viscount, in September of last year." Sir Philip examined the papers. The church waited. Eleanor had not moved. She had not spoken. She stood where the ceremony had placed her, beside the man she had been about to marry, with her hands at her sides and the compass pressed against her palm, and she looked at Nathaniel with the expression of someone watching a wall give way that she had leaned against for so long she had forgotten it was not part of her. "The documents are in order," Sir Philip said at last, and the words fell into the room with the finality of a seal pressed into wax. Arabella Forster was the first to adjust. She released her mother's arm, straightened her shoulders, and directed her gaze toward Nathaniel with the rapid assessment of a woman recalculating. Then she looked at Eleanor, and something in her face shifted. Not into warmth, but into the recognition that the woman she had called a charity case at the church door not 1 hour ago was now betrothed to a viscount. And the mathematics of the morning had changed beyond retrieval. Mrs. Penwick sat down. She sat down the way a structure sits down when the thing holding it upright is removed, without decision, without grace, simply folding into the pew behind her and placing both hands flat on the seat, as if the wood might shift beneath her if she did not hold it still. Her face had lost its careful brightness. What remained was smaller and older, and stripped of the particular warmth that had always cost Eleanor more than any coldness could have. Bertram opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The consent," he said. "She gave her consent." There were witnesses. The consent was given under the understanding that Captain Ashworth was dead. "Mr." Dowling said quietly from the chancel rail, and Eleanor felt a rush of surprised gratitude toward the mild curate who had never once, in 14 months, called her the vicar's charity case. "That understanding has been shown to be false. The ceremony cannot proceed. If you have watched the moment when the door finally opens in a room where someone has been standing too long alone, you know already how this will feel. The story is not finished. It is only beginning to breathe." Nathaniel turned to Eleanor. He did not reach for her. He did not touch her. He stood 3 paces from her and looked at her with the full, steady attention of a man who had ridden 600 miles to look at her exactly this way. And his eyes were the color of smoke over a country that had burned while he was away. And they held in them the thing he had not said, and would not say in front of these witnesses. Because the thing he needed to say was not for the church. "Eleanor," he said. "Her name," he said, not Miss Graves. Her Christian name, spoken in his voice for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, and an ocean of silence, and the sound of it in the nave of her father's church was the sound of a key turning in a lock she had believed sealed shut. Her hand opened inside her glove, the compass pressed against her palm, warm from her skin. "You kept it," he said, and his voice was low enough that only she and Bertram and the curate could hear. "You said you would come for it," she answered, and the sentence was steady, and her eyes were not. The church began to breathe again. Individual sounds separated from the collective hush. A pew creaked. A child in the gallery whispered a question to its mother. Mrs. Haddow, still standing at the door, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something older. Sir Philip Alderton rose from his seat with the deliberate authority of a man who understood that the next 5 minutes would determine how this morning was remembered for the next 50 years. "Lord Ashworth," he said, "welcome home." It was nothing. 2 words and a title. It was everything. It was the patronage of the county settling itself around Nathaniel's shoulders like a coat, the social order rearranging itself in real time to accommodate a man it had mourned and a woman it had dismissed, and Eleanor saw the rearrangement happen in the small specific movements of every face in the nave. The turned heads turning forward, the whispers resolving into nods, the fans that had been raised to shield mouths lowering again, because there was nothing left to say behind them. Bertram left the church without speaking again. He walked past Nathaniel without looking at him, and past Eleanor without acknowledging her, and through the nave without meeting a single eye, and Mrs. Penwick followed him at a distance of 4 paces, her back very straight, and her chin raised and her brightness entirely gone. The church watched them leave, the way a congregation watches a departing processional it has not been asked to join, with polite attention. And no sound. Eleanor stood in the nave of her father's church, with the compass in her hand, and the borrowed gown pinned at her waist, and the sound of the bells dying away into the summer air. And she understood that the morning she had woken into was not the morning she was living in now, and that the shape of every day after this one would be different from the shape she had prepared herself to accept. Nathaniel looked at her. His face was still and marked and tired, and the scar along his jaw caught the light from the east window. And his eyes held the particular quality of a man who has done the one thing he crossed the world to do, and does not yet know what the silence that follows it will contain. "Come outside," he said. A command, issued in the low, flat voice of a man accustomed to issuing orders in circumstances where obedience meant survival. And Eleanor heard the protection inside it, the way she had always heard the protection inside his level voice, and she went. They stood in the churchyard in the June light, with the yew trees casting their shadows across the stones, and the bay horse pulling at the ring on the lych gate, and Mrs. Haddow weeping quietly beside the wall. Nathaniel did not speak for a long time. He stood beside Eleanor with 3 feet of sunlit air between them, and looked at the church, and then at the graves, and then at her. And his expression was the expression of a man adding figures in a column that he already knows will not balance. "George is dead," he said at last. "He died in September. An inflammation of the lungs. I did not know until 3 days ago." "I know," Eleanor said. I heard when it happened. Mrs. Haddo told my father. He wrote me a letter, Nathaniel said, before he died. I found it at Kelmore, in his desk, unposted. He had written the direction on the envelope, and he had sealed it, and he had not sent it. He paused. He forgave me for leaving. He said he understood why I went. He said the compass was mine to keep. Eleanor's breath caught, the compass in her glove. George's compass, carried through campaigns, returned with a dead man's effects, kept against the pulse of a woman who had survived 11 months by holding the only solid thing the world had left her. He was wrong to forgive me, Nathaniel said, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear. I left because I wanted glory, and he died alone. And the letter he wrote to tell me it was all right sat in his desk for 3 weeks, because he could not walk to the post office, and there was no one in the house to carry it for him. He forgave you, Eleanor said. You did not have to earn it. Nathaniel looked at her. His eyes were steady, and his jaw was set, and the scar was a pale line in the sunlight. And for an instant, the discipline broke, the way ice breaks over a river in March. Not with a crash, but with a slow spreading fracture that lets the water through in the places where the current was always strongest. I have carried that letter for 3 days, he said. I have carried your compass for 3 years. I do not know which weighs more. She did not answer. She looked at him and felt the specific physical awareness of his presence that she had felt beside the same yew trees 2 years ago. The warmth along her arm, the altered quality of the air between them, the way her body oriented itself toward him without permission. Come away from the stones, he said, quieter now. There is a carriage at the inn. I will take you to Kelmore. They married 3 weeks later, at the same church, with Mr. Dowling reading the service and Mrs. Haddo standing in the front row where Mrs. Penwick had stood, and Sir Philip Alderton signing the register in his careful square hand. Eleanor wore a gown that fitted her. It was not white, and it was not borrowed. It was the soft blue-gray of early morning, chosen by Mrs. Haddo from a dressmaker in the county town, and it had no pins. Kelmore Park stood on its hill above the village, with its windows open for the first time in a year. The rooms smelled of beeswax and lavender, because Mrs. Haddo had spent 3 weeks airing and polishing and setting fires in every grate, and the garden had been cut back to show the gravel paths, and the long library on the first floor had been cleared and dusted, and its shelves checked against the inventory George had kept in his precise slanted hand. On the evening after the wedding, Eleanor sat in the library with the fire low and the windows open to the summer dark, and a cup of tea growing cool beside her on the table. The room was warm and smelled of old books and new wood smoke, and from somewhere below she could hear Mrs. Haddo giving instructions to the kitchen girl about the morning bread. Nathaniel came in from the garden. He had been walking, the way he walked most evenings now, moving through the grounds of his brother's house with the deliberate attention of a man learning the dimensions of a life he had not expected to inherit. He sat down across from Eleanor, and did not speak for a while, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that lives between two people who have survived a thing together and are still learning the shape of the quiet that follows it. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her gown and drew out the compass. She had carried it in her glove for 11 months and in her pocket for 3 weeks, and its brass casing was warm and dark with handling, and the engraved letter on its face had been worn smooth at the edges by her thumb. She placed it on the table between them. Nathaniel looked at it. He reached inside his coat and withdrew the letter, George's letter, still folded in its unposted envelope with the direction written in his brother's hand. He placed it beside the compass. The compass and the letter sat together on the table in the firelight, and neither of them spoke, and the room held them the way rooms hold people who have come home to a place they were not certain they would ever reach. Outside, the last blackbird of the evening sang its descending phrase from the yew at the garden wall, and the sound traveled through the open window and settled over the compass and the letter and the 2 cups of tea and the low fire and the woman who had waited and the man who had returned, and it was enough. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story reached you, carry it forward.